Well, good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 13th meeting of 2012 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind members to turn off their mobile phones as they do affect the broadcasting system. The first item today is to seek the agreement of the committee to take agenda item 2 in private. The purpose of this item is to allow the committee and its budget advisor to discuss themes for consideration in its scrutiny of the draft budget 2013-14. Are members agreed? Okay. You can. Okay, can I welcome you back to the public session following the committee's discussion with the budget advisor on the themes for the scrutiny of the draft budget 2013-14. The committee will now hear its first evidence on the Water Resources Scotland Bill from the Scottish Government Bill team. The aim of this session is to allow the committee to obtain an overview of the bill's provisions. The committee will have the opportunity to raise more specific issues or political points when it takes evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities in November. So can I welcome the witnesses today? We have Christina Phillips, Bill Manager, Water Industry Team, Bob Irvine, Deputy Director, Climate Change and Water Industry Division, and Stephen Rees, Legal Directorate from the Scottish Government. Aileen, would you like to start this evidence session, please?
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to you. Thanks very much for coming on to the committee this morning. In the policy memorandum of the Water Resources Scotland Bill, under the heading of Policy Objectives, paragraph 2, it states that the bill sets a framework to develop the value of Scotland's water resources, Scotland's water knowledge and Scotland's water technology. The successful achievement of this vision will be to the benefit of the people of Scotland and more widely will contribute to the better global management of water, the planet's most precious resource. The increase in the value should be measured widely in economic, environmental and social terms. End of quote. Can I ask, on the back of what it says in paragraph 2, whether you could briefly outline the actual purpose of the bill, and if you could perhaps say also why legislation is necessary to achieve the aims of the bill?
Yes, certainly. And thank you very much for allowing us to come this morning. Excuse me. The statement that you just read out summarises what is a very ambitious and long-term agenda that ministers have created and been developing over the last year or so. And it covers a number of areas of government activity. There's an economic agenda within it, there's an environmental agenda within it, there's a social agenda within it, there's a research science type agenda. Within it there are many strands. And it also reflects a wider global sense of the importance of water as a resource. As the world changes, as globalization continues, as population pressures and so on put more pressure on the water resource globally. Ministers recognise that Scotland, relatively speaking, is in a very fortunate position in being a water-rich country. And they wish to ensure that together Scotland's public bodies and private sector properly recognise that and work within the developing sense of water as a very important resource to maximise both our custody and management of our water resource, but the opportunity it actually creates going forward. Now, as I said, that is very ambitious and also a very long-term agenda. Our water environment is actually very well managed at the moment, and there is a very robust statutory framework to provide for that. However, it is not actually perfect, and it needs continually to be managed and developed and improved. And part of the bill actually achieves that. Scottish water is very important in this agenda, although not exclusively, and it has, over the last 10 years, performed really well in its core functions of providing drinking water and managing wastewater. And there are a number of areas in which we can clarify its functions, but also on the basis of success in those functions, challenge it, shall we say, to develop further into other areas and expand its activity, and the bill encourages or provides the basis for Scottish Water to do that. The wider agenda about creating the sense of a hydronation, which is in the first section of the bill, is perhaps the part of the legislation that responds most directly and critically to that statement of objective. Why is it necessary for that to be achieved through legislation? I think the answer to that is because ministers want to heighten that sense of the importance of this agenda and the level of challenge in it, and they want to be able to bring together public agencies and other bodies who have a contribution to make to this agenda, really to work very hard to work out how best to take forward that agenda, to develop a plan of action and to identify how we can successfully convert Scotland into something that can credibly be described as a hydronation. And that is what the first part of this bill does, through giving ministers the obligation actually to work hard on that objective, through giving them powers to engage and indeed direct relevant public agencies to participate in that, and perhaps most importantly, giving them an obligation actually to report in a formal sense to Parliament about the progress in the activities that is made on that 3-year horizon.
Thanks very much, Bob. Can I also ask, on the back of that, in terms of the level and the nature of consultation that took place prior to the publication of the bill?
Sure. Well, as is reported in the policy memorandum and indeed in other documents, there were in fact 2 formal consultations on the development of this agenda. The most recent being at the start of this year in February, which set out a more detailed conception of a number of the activities that the hydronation agenda actually has, and presented some of the draft clauses. The outcome of that consultation is summarised within the policy memorandum. But broadly speaking, the same representations and comments came in both the consultation exercises. And I think ministers were very encouraged both by the number of responses that there actually were. You know, it went a little bit beyond the usual suspects of Scottish Water and SEPA, and, you know, the very tight set of stakeholders in the water industry, which confirmed to ministers that there was a sense of what they were about here. But broadly speaking, the comments that came forward supported the general thought that there is more that Scotland can make collectively of being a water-rich or a water-fortunate country. There was also a recognition that there's more that Scottish Water could actually do, but a real concern or request that in pushing Scottish Water or for Scottish Water to push itself into other areas of activity beyond its core functions, care must actually be taken not to compromise the successful operation of those core functions, which are, you know, pretty vital to health and well-being of Scotland. That was broadly the outcome of the consultation, and I know that the committee has also received a number of comments on the bill as published, which again reflect some of the points that the government's consultation had, but actually go at some points into more detail on specific provisions now that they are available. And, you know, we are more than happy actually to discuss some of the implications of those comments, if that would help the committee at any point.
Thanks very much, Bob. I know you've touched on some of the issues that
Yeah.
were raised by the respondents, but were there any other key issues that you could perhaps sort of say to the committee this morning that were raised by respondents to the consultation, and perhaps to sort of state how these were incorporated into the bill itself?
Yeah. I think one significant comment was in relation to the definition of value as it's expressed in the bill, and whether that was simply about economic or financial value, and a concern from those engaged in environmental activities that such an interpretation of the bill of the concept of value would be unnecessarily narrow and might actually compromise other objectives. And generally speaking, I think ministers accept that point, that we do not see value in this context as solely limited, and we wish to make it clear that that does embrace the environmental benefits out of the water environment and the social aspects as well. There was also some issues about the extent to which Scottish Water as a public body, supported through government borrowing or lending, might be in a preferential position in certain marketplaces, particularly if it was going into the renewable energy area. And we fully recognise that, and there is no intention or will of ministers actually to put Scottish Water in a preferential market position. Indeed, their expectation is that they should make a proper economic return in whatever areas they do engage in. The renewable or the energy area is subject to its own form of regulation, and if other players are concerned about Scottish Water's activities, then they can make appropriate representations to that. But ministers are very clear in their transactions with Scottish Water that they are not actually subsidising them into areas, and that the other side of that is the extent to which customers of Scottish Water might be exposed to risk in the areas of non-core activity. And again, one of the minor provisions in the bill is actually to clarify the distinction between core and non-core activities, with the objective of protecting customers from exposure to those risks. And we would not expect Scottish Water to take an unduly risky approach towards future activities and investment, and certainly its present board and executive team is actually very prudent and wise in its approach to commercial activities, and it will be for ministers to ensure that it maintains that approach. So there were comments there from the environmental side, from business side. The commentary on the social side again recognise that Scotland can actually make a contribution in wider areas by supporting places where water is a real problem, particularly in places in the developed world. And Minister's announcement in June of the Climate Justice Fund begins actually to enable that. But much of the commentary was just, can you actually do something and say what we're doing here? It's not necessarily commentary that would affect the way the bill is actually drafted, but about, if you like, requiring ministers actually to show can do and how they are going to take forward some of the statements in relation to the hydro agenda that they've actually made.
Very much for that detailed response.
Margaret?
Good morning. The consumer focus has actually indicated to the committee that the benefits of the proposal in the bill to consumers is actually unclear. Can you explain how consumers will actually benefit from the proposals in the bill?
This is consumers of Scottish Water. Well, as I said, the first position is to make sure that consumers are not disbenefited or are not exposed to undue risks as a result of Scottish Water going into other areas, and a provision in the bill and also Minister's general instructions to Scottish Water will achieve that. There's now a very significant distinction made in the legislation between the core activities and the non-core activities, so that it would not be Minister's intention, if you like, to subsidise activities in the core, in the non-core activity through profits made through the core business. Whether in the fullness of time, if the core business is seriously and significantly profitable and delivers significant returns to Scottish Water as a whole, that should potentially and in theory benefit customers by making those funds available to Scottish Water to invest in improvement of its core service. That will largely be for ministers to determine in looking at the improvement needs of Scottish Water in its sewerage and its water supply network, and also looking at the financial requirements alongside the determination of charges. So a very successful Scottish Water, if it's successful in its non-core activities, it should be equally successful in its core activities and continue to improve both the level of service that it offers to customers and its value for money as well. There's also a slightly more abstract concept about how ministers can actually customers can actually benefit. If you bear with me, if part of this agenda is about raising the international profile of Scotland and encouraging Scottish Water actually to display itself and work abroad in other areas, then that should actually enhance its levels of skill. It should expose it to more innovative pressures and practices, which, as well as exporting, it can bring back to run its own business. And we would hope that there would be an efficiency gain out of that. How much that would be, I don't know. But it would be interesting for the committee to explore those possibilities with Scottish Water as and when they come before you later this session.
Thank you. The next question I have is the committee has also heard concerns that the duty placed on Scottish ministers in Section 1 focuses too much on developing the water resources for economic purposes and doesn't include sufficient mentions of environmental and social factors. Can you respond to these concerns?
Yes, well, I think I tried to address that in responding to Ms. MacLeod earlier. I'm not sure I can really add to that. To some extent, it's a little bit of a legal point about what how you describe value, and if you like, ministers will declare that their conception of value goes wider than financial value, and they will look to secure through the various activities that they stimulate and facilitate in this agenda things that are of environmental benefit and things that are of social benefit as well. Stephen, do you want to comment on the legalities of that?
Well, I mean, the Section 1 of the bill provides that ministers are to take account of or to take steps to ensure the development of the value of Scotland's water resources in ways that are sustainable. And value is defined as economic and other benefit. Now, other benefit clearly encompasses social and environmental concerns. The fact that the words environmental and social don't appear in that definition of value, you can make arguments, about whether those words should appear from a presentational perspective, but in terms of the legal effect, it's quite clear that value encompasses things more broad, that are broader than purely economic value.
Can I just add on to this, and maybe you can give me and tell me, does the bill actually include some sort of legislation that Scottish Water is actually accountable for actually not adhering to the pollution laws themselves as well? Because there was an article in the Herald at the weekend that says for 2 years a number of sewage works and plant works and the organic recycling factory at Cumbernauld have actually been repeat offenders. So is there anything within the bill that will make Scottish Water actually accountable and make sure that this stops?
Well, no. That's not the subject of this bill. I mean, those particular activities are also are already subject to close control by SEPA. They're all subject to what are known as car licenses under the Water Environment and Water Services Act, and the reporting that you refer to does note that there are instances where allowed emissions or whatever are exceeded. Many of those are for reasons that are predicted and understood by both Scottish Water and SEPA, and while they are of concern to the environment, they're not, if you like, concerned from the governance or accountability point of view. Some of them actually do reflect the failures of systems or failures of managerial control, and those are pursued. And where it is considered appropriate, SEPA will take enforcement action, which can actually lead to a prosecution, and the drinking water quality regulator as well. That legislative framework is pretty secure. It is continually reviewed. There is a proposal coming forward about better regulation to, if you like, tighten up and modernise some aspects of SEPA's interaction with those it controls. So we would hope that such failures, while some are probably inevitable given the facts of life, they are not significant in the future. But again, I know the committee is going to ask for evidence from SEPA, and there might be an issue that you would want to explore with them. But Scottish Water is fully accountable and takes these things extremely seriously.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's detail we'll get into next week, because SEPA are coming to give evidence next week. Adam.
Who owns Scotland's water?
That's a good question. You want the short answer or the long answer? I think Stephen will kind of be very itchy. Will be very itchy for a moment, but I shall if you like, put the ball in play. I think it all depends which water you're actually talking about here and what you mean by ownership. Yeah, I mean, if you have a bit of land which has a loch in it or whatever, circumscribed, then you would be deemed to own that. Other people might have certain rights in relation to it, whether conferred through a SEPA authorisation, or indeed you as a landowner allow people to fish in it or boat or whatever. So there can be certain rights. The more tricky thing is who owns flowing water, and I think not even the Institutes of Justinian in the kind of 2,000 years ago quite actually pulled off a conclusive answer to that. But Stephen, do you want to?
Yeah, the position isn't entirely clear, and as Bob alludes to, it does vary very much depending on the circumstances. Very broadly, running water is generally not owned but as Bob says, is subject to rights essentially to not do anything to detrimentally affect those downstream of you, essentially. So you can't affect the flow of those downstream of you. Other bodies of water, stagnant water and lochs, it does depend on the surrounding land ownership. And there can, in certain circumstances, be, well, whether it's ownership or an exclusive right to use the water is slightly unclear, but it's a complex patchwork of legal principles that we've kind of inherited over the centuries. So I'm not sure. It's probably more properly the subject of a university thesis rather than a presentation from me here just now.
But it can be regarded as a public good.
Well, I think probably the reason why, in a sense, there isn't provision for why much water in the water environment in its natural state is not owned is because it is seen as something that's common to all and exists for the benefit of all, so it can't be appropriated by one person unless you actually abstract it in a container and take it away. But yeah.
That's why I'm asking these questions. Is this definition of value? It's at the core of the purpose of the bill, how we actually develop the value of Scotland's water resources. And of course, it's not just a value for this generation, it's a value for future generations as well. And perhaps a lack of definition beyond the economic value of the water is what's concerning some of the, like the Centre for Water Law, who argue that surely there should be an overriding concern for the protection of the water environment, and the fundamental underlying principle that we should be taking an ecosystems approach, and perhaps that's maybe something that we should be returning to in future witness sessions.
Well, I would certainly encourage you to do that. What I would actually say in response to the first point there is that the Water Environment and Water Services Act, known to those who like to joke about these things as the WOOS Act, does actually apply to all water and all water bodies in Scotland, and ownership is not an issue there. The priority to the sustainable management of water bodies in Scotland through that Act is actually quite clear and cuts across ownership. I suppose you might infer from that water is regarded as a public good. You might also infer from the rights that Scottish Water is actually given in relation to its ability to abstract and define areas of ground in relation to drinking water and the controls and management systems that have to be put in place as a result of that. You might also say that carries the implication that water in those areas is to be regarded as a public good, i.e. accessible for a defined public purpose. So as Stephen said, there are many university students kind of busting their brains on some of aspects of this. I do not know whether you're going to take evidence from the Centre for Lost, but I'm sure that'll be an interesting discussion. And if there is a serious point here that requires to be addressed and can only be addressed through some legislative means, the ministers will be more than willing to consider it and consider it very seriously, because it is, as you say, very close to the purpose of that ministers have set out in this agenda.
If I could perhaps just add that the bill does provide that the value of water resources includes the economic and other benefit deriving from the use or activities in relation to the resource. So it is this idea of the use of the water which can be separate from ownership. You can have a right to use water without necessarily owning it. So value can accrue that way.
Taking evidence from them on the 24th of October, but we're also going to visit them at Dundee, probably on the 25th of September. So.
Well, I think we can obviously
Tease
return
it out
to
there.
these issues then. On an unrelated point, Section 3 lists a number of designated bodies that the Scottish ministers may direct in relation to developing Scotland's water resource. Can you give some sort of indications of the types of directions that ministers could give to the designated bodies, and why is this necessary?
Well, directions are used by ministers, I have to say, sparingly, but they are used if it is necessary to define for a body, for an agency or a body, a very specific set of activities or purposes. The point of putting it in here is to confirm ministers' seriousness of purpose and the serious wish to have a high level of engagement with these bodies. But it could be possible in the future for a direction actually to say to one or all of these bodies that they have to engage in specific activities. Shall we say they actually have to have a subsidiary which develops experimental prototypes for gizmos or systems which would assist water management, and that they actually have to participate in some way in this subsidiary. And the purpose of doing that in that way would be to put some kind of ring fence around some of the financial risks that we've spoken about. You might want to direct all or some of these bodies actually to engage in areas abroad, whether for humanitarian or for profitable reasons. Potentially anything within this ambit, subject to it being consistent with the overall purpose and the other statutory frameworks around those bodies, could be the subject of a direction. We have no specific, or ministers have no specific proposition to make a direction at the moment.
Nothing in the bill which suggests those directions would be consulted upon prior to coming into effect. Is that an omission, or is that well, it is an omission? Could you tell us why that public consultation is not part of that exercise?
I'm not sure that's actually correct. My understand. Well, in fact, I think Section 3. Oh no, sorry, no. I know I'm incorrect. That's actually a bit modifying the list. No, you're right. My apologies.
Yes, we will consider that. We noticed a few responses to the call for evidence did raise that point, that they would like some form of consultation, so we'll certainly consider that.
Okay.
Okay, Alex.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'd like to move on to part 2 of the bill, the control of water abstraction. I've got a few questions regarding that. The first of all one is, why was it felt that it was unnecessary to have a formal consultation on the abstraction proposals?
I don't think it felt unnecessary to have a formal consultation. It was just the timescale within which this the need for this provision was actually identified made that very difficult. And we did actually conduct some engagement with key stakeholders prior to it being developed. So it's not, from that point of view, out of a blue sky, but the timetable told against us.
Did you feel
the real answer to you?
Did you feel that you reached the right stakeholders and that the quality of the interaction was appropriate? Well,
I would hope we have, and there are additional comments that the committee has received on this provision, which we shall look at with great care, and also we are very interested to hear how the committee hears from the people that come before it in the next few weeks to see whether we have this provision in the right space. But I think that we did as much as we could actually to get the purpose and structure of this provision as clear as possible. And it's certainly, from a legal point of view, it is actually a workable proposition as it stands.
Can you explain how the proposed control of water abstraction provisions complement the existing regime under the controlled activities regulations, and why a new authorisation scheme is required for the very large-scale abstractions?
Yeah, the car authorisation, which is granted by SEPA, is when I say pretty narrowly, I don't really mean narrowly. I mean it is narrowly focused on the environmental aspects of any application, and that is the only factor that SEPA can take into account in awarding an authorisation. Ministers felt that, particularly in view of the if you like, the expanding sense of the importance of water resource and some of the developments that might or might not happen to that, they wanted the opportunity to take a wider set of factors into consideration in looking at any application for particularly large abstractions. The considerations that they would want to take into account, some of them are actually listed here, but it is to make sure that, if you like, this in granting an abstraction, an authorisation for a large abstraction, nothing is really done which would compromise something that would develop in the medium to long term, which would, if you like, be difficult to accommodate with that abstraction. This is particularly so if there is the possibility of a developing commodity market in water, where large amounts might be moved around. There is talk of that. Whether it is practicable or not, we shall actually see. But that is one of the things at the back of Minister's mind. Also, what the wider impact of a very large-scale abstraction is in the local circumstance. The disruption caused by transportation or building pumping stations or whatever might be very significant for the type of abstraction we're talking about here. SEPA would not necessarily take that into view. So it's to give ministers that wider view, but also slightly longer term perspective about the nature of how the water sector is developing, that they felt it was necessary to have this additional power.
You've given quite a lot of context
Yes.
in that answer as to why this may have happened, but why was the 10 megalitre limit decided upon?
Well, that was following discussion with SEPA in particular, and it was just looking at the range of abstractions that they actually are, that above 10 megalitres there are very few actually existing abstractions, so they are exceptional, and a new one would be very exceptional if it were to be made and came to Scotland. Again, that might not be the right level for all time, so there's the opportunity to vary it. But ministers feel that it is a credible level in terms of its size and, if you like, exceptional nature to allow this provision to begin its life.
There's a couple of issues that have come from submissions that
Yes.
we've received, and one relates to that limit, and it's the suggestion that perhaps the abstraction limit should be based on consumption rather than the level of abstraction. How do you react to that suggestion?
Well, I think we want really to look at that, what people actually mean by defining it as consumption. And certainly, you know, the exceptions that are given here imply that what we are looking at, if you like, is an abstraction from a water source. It is an abstraction. It doesn't actually take it and kind of spray it back in again or whatever like that. And we thought that using the exemptions was a way of confirming that. But if there is a way of defining a consumptive abstraction, as it were, beyond that, then we would really want to look at that. So again, we do wish to engage with the representations that have been made in response to the committee's request on that particular point to see if there's a better way of dealing with this.
Another representation we've had is from our friends in the Scotch whisky industry who would like to be exempted from the abstraction consent regime. What are your views on that type of request?
Well, again, I think that we would want to discuss with them exactly why they felt this. I mean, ministers will, of course, always endorse the value to the Scottish economy of the whisky industry and the importance of the water environment to them. And it may be that they will wish to accede to that request. But I think before we do that, we need to engage with them and discuss exactly why they feel that they should be entitled to such an exemption.
Thank you very much.
Do we move? Oh, yes, sorry.
Follow up on the issue of exemptions. You mentioned in your remarks the perhaps development of bulk sales of water. I think you called it commodity trading. Is there anything in the bill which would allow Scottish Water to undertake these bulk sales without the say-so of ministers, or is something built into the bill to ensure that that wouldn't happen?
Well, this abstraction provision would apply in Scottish Water's case because it would be an abstraction outside their core functions, where they wishing to do it and were they above the threshold. Other than that, no, and other than the existing governance arrangement with Scottish Water, through which ministers in effect approve the business plans, and this would be a pretty significant activity and likely to come in there. There's nothing specific in this Act relating to that activity for Scottish Water.
So the new exemption regime would not, any sort of bulk sales situation where water is being taken out of Scotland, Scottish ministers would have control of that situation. Okay.
Okay, we move on to Scottish Water's functions. Malcolm.
Right, yeah, moving on to part 3 of the bill. Can you explain why the provisions in part 3 are necessary when Scottish Water already successfully, I think, provides non-core functions through Scottish Water Horizons?
Yeah, Stephen, do you want to say? I mean, it's largely for clarification.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question, or just?
Well, it's really just the issue about the non-core function work that's already done by Scottish Water Horizons. So I suppose some people are questioning why the provisions are necessary.
Well, under the pre-existing legislative framework, Scottish Water have the ability to engage in activities out with their non-core functions, provided they don't compromise its non-core functions. The purpose of the provisions in part 3 is to go slightly further and place a proactive obligation on Scottish Water to engage in renewable energy and to use its assets. So it's really a slight shift from an ability to do so to a proactive obligation to do so in these areas.
The next question you made to some extent I've answered in reply to Margaret McCulloch's general question about this, but this is specifically about the provisions in Part 3. How can you explain how those provisions promote and promote the interests of Scottish Water's customers?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I've anything. I mean, I can repeat that. Perhaps I can
if you feel you've
be a bit more
it
successful in summarising it.
It was specifically in relation to Part 3, I suppose. But if you feel you've already answered it, then
yeah. Well, I mean, the most important bit for customers is Section 24, which is about tightening the distinction between core and non-core functions which has implications for the charging of customers. Yeah.
Okay. How do you respond to concerns that the proposals in the bill will have a negative impact on private sector providers of services that Scottish Water, now that Scottish Water may choose to invest in services like waste management? I think some concerns have been raised by some private sector providers in relation to that.
Well, as I said earlier, it's Minister's expectation that Scottish Water engage in those activities on properly commercial terms, and if they need to make that more explicit in anything that they communicate to Scottish Water or report elsewhere, they will do that. It has to be said at the moment that Scottish Water's activities are, I don't think, compromising or causing concerns in that area. In particular, in the waste management stuff, they are very welcome participants and indeed leading and stimulating that market. You know, they may have different roles at different times as the market, as those markets develop. But as I said before, it is not Minister's intention to subsidise or for customers to subsidise Scottish Water to engage in markets which should be on operating on properly commercial terms.
Some of those concerns may have arisen because of Minister's power to lend to Scottish Water at any rate Ministers choose, but in practice Ministers ensure that if they're lending for non-core activities, they do so at a commercial rate so as to comply with EU state aid competition law. So that aspect of those concerns, although not explicitly addressed in the bill, Ministers obviously have to comply with European law when lending to Scottish Water. So,
okay, I understand that. And finally, what evidence does the Scottish Government have to indicate that the provisions in Part 3 will actually benefit the Scottish economy?
Well, I mean, the evidence is rather contingent, isn't it? To the extent that Scottish Water is successful in other areas, it will, add to Scottish GDP, and as I said, raise Scotland's profile and influence, which will be to the benefit of Scotland and potentially also to Scotland's customers. And again, that this is just part of the ambition of the hydronation agenda, is to increase the value of this particular sector to Scotland. I mean, it is a sector that is in many areas growing. The whole, as we said before, the whole issue of the management of water services is crucially important in many developing areas, particularly as populations urbanise. And if Scottish Water can actually make a contribution to that, can actually use its expertise and skills and also make use of the skills and expertise that are in our engineering consultancies and are in many of our academic environments, then that is a very significant potential gain for the Scottish economy.
Okay, thanks very much.
Can I just follow up on that? Obviously received some evidence which criticises Scottish Water in relation to its partnerships with private sector providers, and notably arguing that Scottish Water activities is actually impacted negatively on the Scottish economy by not encouraging Scottish research and development, Scottish expertise in building up the area. They've actually gone out with Scotland to do so. They've also argued in the paper received from the Jimmy Reid Foundation and the Cuthberts, argued that the way that the capital investment is financed is dubious, I think would be the argument that they make in terms of the returns on capital are too great. Excessive profits, I think, is the argument. Now, to what extent, in terms of developing the value of the Scottish water resources, to what extent are these issues going to be taken into consideration in this particular bill? Or can we develop that within our consideration of the bill?
The bill really touches on neither of these issues directly. Scottish Water's charges are regulated according to a statutory framework. The obligation on the regulator in terms of lowest reasonable cost to customers is actually clear. I imagine that you will want to interview the Water Industry Commission as well. It is my view that the concern that Mr. and Mrs. Cuthbert expressed about the regulatory framework and indeed the regulated asset base doesn't really apply in Scotland in the terms that they suggest. And I think that both Scottish Water and the WIC would be able to give you a more detailed response to that. On the first point about the procurement and so on, again, you will wish to pursue that with Scottish Water. And from Minister's point of view, their procurement activity has been very progressive and active, and they have developed a very commendable structure to ensure that local contractors and the local economic contribution is properly regarded within that process. I mean, it is true that when they started, for whatever reason, they lacked a certain number of very high-level program management and design skills in particular, which they actually had to import. But part of that, as I've explained before, is actually about learning those skills and beginning to take them into the body. As always, Scottish Water must actually behave in not only the context of its own legislation about securing best value and so on, but also in European and UK competition law, which is fairly tight in the processes and how you can actually engage with potential contractors and tenderers. And Scottish Water has developed that progress over its successive investment rounds, so it's now actually quite sophisticated. And while it always inevitably disappointing that not 100% of the skills required or the materials required or whatever are kind of sourced from down the road, our feeling is that as much as is practically possible, consistent with those frameworks and consistent with the best value obligations that they actually have, does actually come from Scotland. And indeed, the Scottish Water Investment Programme is a very, very significant part of the total business of the Scottish construction and engineering sector, and will be so for the foreseeable future.
Okay, well, thank you for that. But something, no doubt, we can pursue And there's a bit of overlap with the other work that we're doing on public procurement as well.
No, I think that would be very helpful, yes. Yeah.
Okay, if we move on to raw water quality, Gordon.
Thank you, Convener. The bill allows Scottish Water to enter into agreements with owners or occupiers of land with a view to taking action to prevent the deterioration of raw water quality or removing and reducing the need to treat that water. Written evidence we've received from Scottish Land and Estates argues that Scottish Water should work in partnership with landowners. Can you explain why Scottish Water needs powers of entry and inspection when it could work in partnership with landowners?
Well, its objective would always be to work in partnership, but it may be that for whatever reason that partnership is not effective, or it may be that there is something that happens on a very short-term basis, you know, some pollutant or some activity on a premise being there that there is a dispute about its origin. So it is a reserve power. I mean, there's not the intention to create Scottish Water as a Stalinist organisation that knocked down farmers' doors, you know, every midnight, as it were. But it is reserved, and also making sure that those partnerships are aware of the seriousness of the purpose behind here. You know, some of these impacts on raw water are very significant in terms of the cost they actually impose on the public networks to remove. And if there's a better way of managing it upstream, as it were, then it is to everyone's interest actually to investigate those. I mean, this is an area that is really rapidly developing, I think, and the potential for this type of agreement with landowners and land managers, or indeed other owners of premises, is just in its infancy. So, we want to, strengthen the ability to develop effective partnerships and really develop new arrangements and new ways of dealing with these issues.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that it would only be used in matters of emergency and when they have to get on the ground quickly to resolve a problem.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I mean, it might help the committee to ask Scottish Water about the, and indeed SEPA, because SEPA are part of this picture as well, and the drinking water quality regulator, about the nature of how the partnership approach with landowners is developing, and in what circumstances, that they have experienced recently, they might actually want to use this type of power.
In relation to SEPA, it's been argued that SEPA is better placed than Scottish Water to carry out monitoring of raw water quality, and that if further monitoring is required, that SEPA should have additional resources here. Can you explain why these proposed new powers are being given to Scottish Water then?
Because it's Scottish Water's responsibility actually to provide clean, fresh drinking water actually to standard, and the incentive should be on them to seek the least cost way of doing that. And if the least cost way of doing that is to engage with a landowner or landowners collectively in a catchment area and say, look, there's a different way that you can do your business, which means that this pollutant won't come into the system, so that we won't actually have to invest in machinery and energy and so on actually to take it out, then that incentive is based on them. SEPA is a passive monitoring and enforcement agency. It's a different set of relationships that is being stimulated through this provision.
Thank you.
Margaret? Got a question?
Yeah. What impact do you hope the proposal in Part 5 will have for licence providers and their customers?
The impact should actually just be to clarify the arrangements which may well be in doubt at the moment as to whether a provider legitimately can actually charge a new customer in these circumstances.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if we move on to the sewerage network, the committee received evidence from several witnesses calling on the proposed powers relating to the maintenance of septic tanks to be strengthened and to allow Scottish Water to take unilateral action and to require the replacement of out-of-date equipment. First of all, how do you respond to these calls?
The provision that's actually in the bill is one part of a much broader exercise that's underway between Scottish Water and SEPA to actually find out. There are lots of septic tanks that aren't registered, so there's a whole exercise there. And then there are other pieces of work which we'd be happy to share with you about looking at the maintenance, looking at what's happening with septic tanks, and just to look at the broader picture of their management. Within this bill, it's one very small provision which is about where there's a group of owners and discharging into one septic tank. It will now not. You won't now need all of the owners to actually give their consent for it to be emptied or maintained. So that should make for better maintenance and emptying, because at the moment we know that it doesn't always happen if someone doesn't give their consent.
But there's been an ongoing registration of septic tanks recently. Has that not worked to satisfaction?
It has worked, but it's still underway. We know that during the conveyancing process, septic tanks are being picked up and registered, but obviously in rural areas, turnover of properties might not happen as quickly as we would like. So there is a big piece of work there still to work on the septic tanks.
But are you saying that people, you know, we've all, as somebody who falls in that category, we've all had plenty of correspondence and know that if we want to sell our homes, then we've got to have this piece of paper to say that it's been licensed. Are you saying that that's not really worked and there's still lots still to be licensed, if you like, or registered or whatever?
Yes, well, we know there are still some that do need to be registered. We also know that we still need to find out where some of them are. There are ones that the owners aren't actually traceable or contactable. So there is a wider piece of work going on, and I'd be happy to provide. We've got a sort of policy document which demonstrates the different actions that are going on to try and address the issue, because I know septic tanks is something that concerns particularly rural communities.
And I've got visions of Scottish Water now saying that out-of-date equipment, which might still be perfectly efficient but isn't a plastic tank, it's an old concrete tank, are going to be told that they've got to replace their septic tanks. Now, Scottish Water don't even bother. It's too much difficulty for them to empty some of these tanks. So they've got no idea. Could they just come along to a household and say, oh, you've got a concrete tank, we don't know if it's working efficiently, get it replaced?
No, we're certainly not stepping onto people's own rights and responsibilities to maintain and upkeep their own tanks. And where SEPA becomes involved is where that tank is creating an impact on the environment. So no, we're certainly not talking about some sort of draconian measure for everyone to immediately update the tanks to something new.
These provisions are about empowering owners of communal tanks to take action where perhaps one or two owners are a bit more reluctant to take steps. It's about empowering one or several of the common owners to take action to maintain their tank in its current form, but to the correct standard and to the correct procedures to avoid discharging inappropriate matter into the environment. So as long as the basic requirements as to the discharge from the tank are met in accordance with the licence or registration under the controlled activities regulations, then the type of tank, there's no need to upgrade the tank as long as it's maintained to the required standards.
Okay, and finally, Aileen, you want to ask some questions on water shortage orders?
Thanks very much, Convener. The committee has also received evidence highlighting concerns from both domestic customers and major water users, such as the Scottish whisky industry, about the potential impact of water shortage orders. Can you outline how often you would expect such orders to be used?
Neither ministers nor Scottish Water actually control the weather. In fact, I don't think anybody controls the weather. But I mean, these are very rare circumstances. I mean, the existing framework of drought owners has been used, I think, only once. And it actually rained before they got all the way through the process. I mean, there are areas every year that are subject to some kind of water stress. The Western Isles this year was a particular case. No one would have predicted that this time last year. And there is a whole set of activities and actions that Scottish Water can actually take ahead of actually cutting off supplies and having standpipes and all the rest of it. And this sets that out. I mean, the important thing for Scottish Water and for customers is really clear communication and early communication if it looks like something's happening, like if the reservoirs are struggling at some point in the year, they can actually give those signals and communicate with customers at the earliest point that they need to think about some aspects of water use. How often that they will happen, I don't know. I mean, our weather is changing, so we might actually expect them to be used more often in the past. An important aspect of revising this set of provisions is to remove the word drought from the statutory framework. So it does talk about water shortage, and water shortage can be for reasons other than the fact it doesn't rain for 3 or 4 months. And you know, the real difficulty that English companies had of having these drought orders and hosepipe bans, well, it was absolutely slating it down outside this summer. Well, I'm not going to say that that would not be a circumstance in Scotland, but it makes it a slightly easier presentational thing to say that we do have a water shortage issue, even though it is raining at the moment. We're not responding to an immediate or present drought. As I said, it may well be because of the changing nature of our weather and climate that these procedures will be used more often in the future than in the past.
And what about in terms of the impact of any restrictions? I mean, how will they be assessed when orders are in force?
Well, again, that will be part of the extended communication between Scottish Water and customers, you know, and knowing where the dialysis patients are, and you know where the special needs are, and what the circumstances of particular industrial or commercial premises, you know, how time sensitive they are to having water either or on or off, if that is part of the regime, will be part of it. I mean, these things just don't happen arbitrarily, you know, and the point of the statutory framework is setting in motion a communications and a planning framework which will manage issues such as those.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, does anyone else have any further questions at this stage? Okay, can I thank you very much for the evidence you've given today. It's very helpful to set the framework for the whole bill. Thank you very much. Can I suspend the session briefly to allow for a change of witnesses? Thank you. we'll just crack on. So, agenda item 4 is Forth Replacement Crossing Project, and we're now get an update on the progress of the Forth Replacement Crossing Project from the Transport Scotland project team. Can I thank the team for providing a written update in advance of the meeting, which members who've had is published with the papers. So can I welcome the witnesses, David Climmy, Project Director, and Lauren Shackman, Project Director. We can start the questions, and Malcolm, you want to kick off on this?
Specific questions, but if we could start just by providing a general update on the progress and timescale of the construction project.
Yes. I'm pleased to report that in the last 6 months since we last came and spoke to you, things have progressed extremely well on the project, on all fronts. On the principal contract in particular, the work there on the caissons for the main tower foundations are now in place, and it's very clear to see the line of the bridge across the Forth now and where the main towers are going to be, and also the approaches on either side. On the north side, the earthworks there for the ferry toll embankment have progressed well, and also the blasting and removal of rock from Winnie Hill is now about 50% complete. And the rock from there has actually been moved to the ferry toll embankment to create the new embankment. So again, that's starting to clearly show where the line of the new road is going to go. On the south side, we've made significant progress on the earthworks around the south abutment area and through Eckland Field, and for the South Queensferry interchange. We've started making good progress there. And also the South Satellite Office is now in place and being used for the management of those works on the south side. On the other contracts, on the 5 ITS contract, the traffic management, the 5 miles of traffic management was removed on time at the end of July, and we're about to start installing the first of 17 gantries tonight on the M90, and those should all be in place by the end of this month or early October, a little weather dependent with wind and so on. On the M9 Junction 1A contract, in spite of the wet weather we've had over the last few months, that has also made excellent progress. A lot of the earthworks have now been completed, and also the paving work for the new slip roads onto the M9 going towards Stirling. And similarly, the bridge, the extension of the bridge over the M9 motorway, all those beams are now in place, as are the beams for the Overton Road Bridge, have also been put in place. So significant progress has been made on that front also. And we're optimistic that that contract will be completed early in the new year. On the Contact and Education Centre, which is the 4th contract of the project, that is also progressing extremely well. The structural envelope is now complete, and the fitting out work is moving on inside. So I think overall on the project, we're continuing to progress on time, on budget, and to have the whole project open by late 2016.
Okay, that's helpful. Well, the budget obviously is pretty prominent in most people's minds, and you're saying it's on budget, so that's good news. I suppose the range, as you know, was stated to be between 1.45 billion and 1.6 billion. Do you have any idea at this stage where the final cost may lie within that range? And if you don't, when might that become a bit clearer?
It's something we keep monitoring on a monthly basis. Probably the item that changes most regularly is the inflation aspect of it. When I reported here 6 months ago, I said that the inflation at that point was towards the high end of our range. Since then, we've seen a significant downturn in inflation, which I think is typical of the global market generally. And now the inflation is actually running at the very low end of the envelope that we predicted. So in terms of that, the longer that goes on, it means that the baseline cost is a lower number, which is then inflated further. So I think at the moment, the best indication that we have is that we're still within that overall envelope, but trending towards the lower end of it, purely because of the way inflation is going.
Okay, thanks. You've obviously highlighted what's been going on during the last few months. Thanks for that. But could you highlight any key events due to occur in the next 6 months which may be of interest to the Parliament?
Certainly, yes. With the way that the smaller contracts have been progressing, we expect that the Contact and Education Centre will be open to the public fully by the beginning of 2013. We expect that the 5 ITS contracts and the M9 Junction 1A contracts will both be completed and fully opened, and that will allow bus hard shoulder running to start operating throughout the scheme. In addition to that, on the principal contract, we'll see the foundation works, because very much this has been the year of the foundations. Those will come to a conclusion, and in the early part of 2013, we'll start to see the main towers actually coming out of the water. So at that point, there really will be a significant change in what you see in the progress of the project.
Okay, thanks very much.
Eileen?
Thanks very much, Convener. In the written update that you provided to the committee, said that last month there were a number of community forums were held in local communities around Rosyth, South Queensferry and Kirkliston. And at the South Community Forum, the issue of localised flooding near to the South compound was discussed following all the exceptionally wet weather that we had during the months of June and July. Can you maybe provide the committee with a bit more information about that flooding incident, and also in particular what action has been taken to ensure this doesn't reoccur?
Certainly, yes. Obviously, it was extremely unfortunate that the flooding did occur. And actually, Lawrence and one of my other colleagues visited a couple of the householders who were affected by the flooding, just to see for themselves what had gone on. As you correctly mentioned, it came after a very wet summer, and then we had some exceptional rain on July the 18th, when not just close to the project, but also in other areas locally, there were a number of flooding incidents, including a landslip on the rail line at Rosyth, some flooding in lime kilns and other areas as well. We did a thorough investigation working with the City of Edinburgh Council, because obviously when these events occur, there can be a number of contributing factors that all come together. So we wanted to make sure that we worked with the City of Edinburgh Council to look at the drainage, to look at the drainage on our site and what else we could do there to reasonably ensure that such an event couldn't happen again, almost no matter what the conditions in the future. Because obviously this was an exceptional event, but we had to look at, okay, what can we do to prevent it happening again? So we actually put in place significant additional drainage work since then within the fields around the site. And Lawrence, would you like to add anything else on the detail?
Yeah, it's just that there's an action plan's been put in place by our contractor to manage any high intensity rainfall event or any rainfall event, and there's a lot more work, as David was saying, to try and mitigate against any other future events. There are a system of pumps in place in that part of the site. Some quite deep excavations have been formed which can be used as sumps for water events as well, and a permanent moves to establish the permanent outfall down towards the Forth has been put in play as well. So we're pretty confident now that there won't be an event like that again. We'll be able to manage it if it does occur, I should say.
Sure, thanks very much. The other question I wanted to ask was in relation to a point that had been raised by Malcolm Chisholm in terms of the update on key events, and it was also included in the written update as well, which indicated that the Permanent Contact and Education Centre remains on schedule to be completed in autumn 2012, but the most recent update does state that we expect the centre to be fully open to the public from January 2013. Is there a reason for any delay there?
Well, it's not a delay. What is happening is that it's a phased opening in effect, because the building, we have to remember, there's two parts of the building. One is the FRC Contact and Education Centre, and there's also 2/3 of it is going to be the new Traffic Scotland Control Centre. So what we're doing is, by the end of November, we expect to have the CEC part of the building ready, and we're organising an initial ministerial event tied in with the naming of the bridge and launching that process at the end of November. But the full opening, and therefore opening for bookings to the public and so on, we don't want to advertise that till January 2013 until we've also well advanced the traffic control centre element of the building as well.
Sure, thanks very much for that clarification. And in terms of the arrangements for public engagement themselves, I mean, how effective do you consider these to be now that the project has been on site for some time, and do you intend to review these arrangements in light of experience that's been gained to date?
It's an area that we keep consistently under review. Obviously, there are a number of working groups and community forums that have been set up as required by the Code of Construction Practice, and we're very keen to we have a feedback loop in all of those to make sure that what we're doing is working, and that it's delivering what the intention was from the Code of Construction Practice. And I think the feedback on all of the groups that we've had so far has been very positive. For example, the Noise Liaison Group, We had contact from members of the public just asking about how the feedback did work and how that was taken into account in the Noise Liaison Group meetings. And Lawrence actually went along to a meeting with them to have about an hour's discussion on that, because they had some questions about the 24-hour working on the marine side, and we were able to go through that with them, explain to them how, if there was an exceedance, how it was dealt with, how it was reviewed, and I think they were comfortable with that process, to see that there was a clear process, that all the notes and the minutes of the meetings are being published on the website, so there is a very clear process for what's going on, and to have that feedback loop. So we are continually monitoring this. I think one example would be on the Traffic Management Working Group that initially met monthly. Because there was significant traffic management coming up in the future, we increased the frequency to 2 weekly. So I think we're being responsive to different areas as the different requirements come into play.
Okay, that's good to hear. Thanks very much.
David, you mentioned the naming of the new bridge. Has there been a lot of public engagement in terms of making suggestions for the new name?
There was, some of it a little ahead of the formal process. Obviously, when it was first announced that there would be a process, there were quite a number of suggestions inevitably came up in the press. What we intend to do now is we've got a naming committee has been appointed. That's going to have its first meeting on the 27th of November, which will be chaired by the Minister for Transport. And following that meeting, there will be a public announcement made about the details of the process and how the public can contribute to that. And with the intention that process can be completed and a new name in place by the summer of 2013.
Okay, Gordon.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you a few things about the refreshed public transport strategy that was published on the 1st of August. Can you outline the key changes in the strategy document from that published in 2010?
Yes, sure. I think we've been working very well together with the local authorities, Sestran, bus operators, and we're also involving Network Rail going forward. As you mentioned, the strategy was refreshed at the beginning of August, and I think looking at all the options in the fourth corridor, if you like, which is essentially Newbridge in the south, right up to Halbeath in the north, and how we can influence public transport usage in that corridor going forward. One of the aspects is to keep going with the group that we have on a 6th monthly basis, and we've got our next meeting in November. And to keep reviewing all of the aspects, particularly in relation to short-term deliverables or targeted areas such as the Newbridge Junction itself, which seems to be a key aspect or a key potential blockage in the system in terms of bus transit in particular. So when now we've got the refreshed strategy in place, we can go to the next meeting and try to look at how we can actually deliver some of these things in the short, medium and long term.
You mentioned influencing transport usage. Can you update us if there's been any work undertaken on possible improvements to the cycle tracks linking the Forth Bridge in Edinburgh?
Not at this moment in time. That's something that we'll look at with Edinburgh Council going further forward. I think you mentioned that previously, but I think one of the big pluses in terms of public transport that's happened since we last came in front of the committee was that the Halbeath Park and Ride site has now started. That's been awarded and it's actually started construction on site, so that's a big positive going forward in terms of being able to take car traffic off of the M90 corridor and put them on buses, and obviously with the bus lanes coming into play both in Fife ITS and the Junction 1A schemes, then that's a good positive aspect that we'll be looking to monitor and see how much patronage that gets going forward.
Right. The Halbeath Park and Ride project, the written update refers to a barley field. What's been done to reduce the environmental impact of the construction at the Halbeath site?
I don't wish to sidestep this too much, but it's being taken forward by Fife Council on obviously the Scottish Government's made a contribution to the Park and Ride site, but Fife Council are taking that forward, and I believe they will be looking carefully at any environmental aspect of that to minimise any disruption to the local farmers and to the travelling public when access is taken off the Crossgates roundabout.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Margaret.
Good morning. The question I have is about subcontractors and suppliers and also employees. You indicated in the written update that 60% of the subcontractors and 87% of the principal contract supplier opportunities have gone to Scottish companies. Can you confirm the proportion of the total expenditure on subcontractor and supply opportunities that these represent, please?
Yes, I mean, in the written update, we gave the actual numbers in terms of quantity of them. In terms of the value, I can provide that information. On the subcontracts, the amount going to Scottish firms is £31 million, and on the supply orders, the value going to Scottish companies is £41 million. So that gives a total awarded to Scottish firms of £72 million.
Okay, thank you. And you also indicated that 1,100 people are now working directly on the FRC project. Can you also provide any sort of breakdown of who these people are, particularly how many of these people were previously unemployed, and how many apprenticeships and trainees are actually working on the site?
Yes, I can. As you're aware, we had specific requirements in the principal contract to deliver an annual average target of 45 vocational training places, 21 professional body training places, and 46 places for long-term unemployed. Those were the targets as an annual average. As of the end of August, we currently have on the site 41 vocational training places, 46 professional body training places, and 56 long-term unemployed. So that's a grand total of 143. Okay. And that is what we expected in the early stages. At the moment, there's still quite a large focus on design, and therefore the professional body training places are roughly double what the target was, whereas the vocational training places are just coming up to the annual average number that we expected now. And as we go forward, we would expect to see the professional numbers dropping down and the vocational numbers ramping up, again, potentially to significantly higher than the target.
So can you just clarify the difference between the vocational training and the professional for me? Yeah,
a vocational training place is identified as something that's a minimum of SVQ level 2. And a modern apprenticeship would be an SVQ level 3, so that's a higher level of training. Mm-hmm. A professional body training place is someone training to become a chartered engineer or a chartered surveyor, something like that. So becoming a member of a recognised professional body.
Right, that's lovely, thank you.
If we move on to traffic management, can you summarise the impact of current traffic management measures on journey times and traffic flows?
Yes, I think the important high-level things to mention first are that, as I mentioned earlier, on the 5 ITS project, all the traffic management on the M90 has now been removed, so there's no impact north of the bridge, and it's going to be at least probably a year and a half before any new traffic management comes onto the main line on the M90 in the ferry toll area. So it's going to be a good break for the people on the north side in terms of any impact on their travel. On the south side, obviously we still have in place the M9 traffic management, and on the spur itself. And something we should flag up is that coming up we have significant paving works going on in the M9 itself, and that will last over about 6 weekends starting at the beginning of October, which is similar to the work that was carried out on 5 ITS, which I think we mentioned to you at the last meeting. So the work that was carried on there in April and May, where we had significant closures. That was actually resulted in only 2 weekends rather than the 4 that we thought it might take. So we've taken all the lessons learned from that and are feeding those into the M9 Junction 1A contractor as well to try to ensure that 6 is an absolute maximum number of weekends that will be affected, and hopefully it will be able to be done in less than that. I think Lawrence may be able to add something specifically about journey times.
Well, as David said, the Junction 1A is really the key area of activity at the moment in terms of traffic management, and really the distances that you've got, depending on whether you're coming southbound down the M9 spur approaching the new junction works, or whether you're coming from the Stirling direction on the M9, you're really only talking about an extra couple of minutes on your journey time, 40 miles an hour as opposed to the 70 miles an hour. And obviously in the mornings, you don't normally go at about 70 miles an hour anyway in that particular area because it's pretty busy. So that's really the impact that the works have at the moment. And as we get towards the end of the year, obviously the traffic management will be lifted, and there will be, as David said, a period of respite for the travelling public in the area until the principal contract tie-in works start in the south, and obviously the more intricate works to construct the new connections around the ferry toll junction in the north.
So the Fife ITS, that was done on time, and it was that you took off the restrictions when you initially said you would.
That's right.
Yes.
And if I remember correctly, you did say to me that the extra journey time was what, 3 minutes or something through that.
That's
so,
correct.
Yeah, and you were able to keep to that.
Yes.
Okay. You also indicated in the written update that major works to upgrade the M9 will, as you've said, commence later this month. So what impact do you expect them to have on the traffic flows, given that you maybe have things that you've learnt from the Fife ITS? And what measures have you taken to mitigate any traffic congestion and delays?
Well, I think in a similar vein to the works on Fife ITS, we'll be advising people if they don't need to make their journey, please don't make it at the weekends, because it will cause some disruption. The way that the works will be undertaken, we will try to provide access through the M9 as far as possible, but because of the way that the works need to be done, there will be some sections of the road which will need to be closed and diversion routes put in place, and they will be very well signed and very well publicised. We'll use all the same media that we did last time for Fife ITS to try and warn people as far as we possibly can. In particular, the variable message signs on the motorway network will be used to warn people in advance. But the upshot of the works will be that the carriageway should last for a good number of years, and there shouldn't be any need to go back in there to do works for 15 years perhaps, as a result of the way that we're doing the works.
And perhaps the other point I could add is that when we've put a lot of work into this with the contractor, and when they initially started planning the work, they were thinking it could take as long as 10 weekends to do. We've now put a lot of work into that to get it down to the 6 that we're currently advertising, and we still believe it may be even able to be better than that. The other thing we've had to take into account is obviously the effect on the travelling public in terms of the traffic management. We've also got the impact that we're very close to Kirkliston, and therefore there's a noise issue where we ought to try to minimise that in working at weekends and so on. So there's quite a balance that needs to be struck between the local residents and the impact on the travelling public, and a lot of work has gone into that to make sure that we try to get the best possible compromise we can and take all of those views into account.
Okay, thanks. And the Fife ITS, when that goes live later this year, what effect, what will it involve, and what effect will it have on the travelling public and the traffic flow?
When Fife ITS goes live, we'll be able to use the overhead gantries and the lane signalling, which is incorporated into the intelligent transport system, which means that we can vary the speed limits and manage the traffic flow. And as David mentioned, initially there won't be any traffic management south of the Fife ITS project because the principal contract are not going to actually do any work on the A90 in that area. So really the use of that system will really come into its own when those major works start to take place later at the end of 2013. They may also be used for managing any backup of traffic from works on the Forth Road Bridge, for example. And it's very much a non-critical activity in terms of the project. We'll be able to get the bus lane running on the Fife ITS project as well. If there is any congestion, then the buses will have the chance to use the hard shoulders, which are designated bus lanes but can be used for all traffic for emergency use. So there's a good piece of infrastructure in place which is suitable for catering for all of the works that are to come, basically.
The largest single benefit is the fact that the bus hard shoulder running will come into operation all the way from Halbeath right to the north end of the existing Forth Road Bridge. So certainly at peak times when traffic can be queuing on the north side of the Forth Road Bridge, it means that the journey times for public transport and buses should be far more guaranteed than they currently are, because they will have this complete bus hard shoulder running in the lane all the way, as I said, from Halbeath to the north end of the Forth Road Bridge.
We are also, just to let you know, we're obviously going to have a publicity leaflet for road users to explain to them how the ITS system will work and what to look out for in terms of the bus lane operation as well. And as a separate exercise, we're having a training session with the bus operators as well, so that all of their drivers know how to use the bus hard shoulder and what to do if there's an incident in the hard shoulder and how it's closed down, and the general operation of it, to make sure that everyone is as aware as possible of what they should and shouldn't do with the new systems in place.
So at your next 6-monthly update, you'll be able to tell us how the ITS is working, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we will. Yes.
Do you feel that you have to put signs up on the gantries, even although there's nothing really to say? Because I object to being told, don't do this, don't do that. You know, could you put please, you know, and maybe a smiley face or something like that, you know, to make it a bit more rather than...
That's useful.
Okay, does anybody else have any more questions? No. Okay, can I thank you very much and look forward to hearing another update in 6 months' time. Thank you very much. Okay, I can just close the meeting now because we've done all the housekeeping bits at the beginning. Thank you very much. I close the meeting.